Some silences are chosen, and some silences are forced onto a person until they forget the difference between the two, and on the morning of the selection, Rowan Aldrich could no longer remember which kind of silence belonged to him. The Aldrich estate had woken before the sun that day, every servant rushing through the halls with folded linens and polished trays, every window thrown open to let in the pale gold light of the ceremony morning. It was the kind of day that only came once in a young Omega's life, the day when the great Alpha Draven Vosk would walk through the selection hall and choose a companion from among the finest Omega families in the region. Mothers had been preparing their sons for months. Fathers had spent fortunes on silk and jewels. And in the Aldrich household, every hope of that fortune rested on one son alone, and it was not Rowan. 19 years old, with silver hair that fell soft and uneven past his ears and grey eyes the color of a quiet morning sky, Rowan stood in the corner of his room while a maid pinned his brother's sleeves instead of his own. He did not mind. He told himself he did not mind, the way he had told himself many things over many years, small lies stacked carefully on top of each other until they felt almost like peace. His mother, Lady Miran Aldrich, swept into the room without knocking, her red gown trailing behind her like a warning. She did not look at Rowan. She looked past him, the way she always did, and told him plainly that he was to sit at the back of the hall, keep his eyes low, and let his brother Kaelan shine. She said it the way one might remind a servant to close a window, quick and certain and without cruelty in her voice, only fact. Rowan nodded. He always nodded. It was easier than asking why his own place in his family had shrunk so small that it could fit into a single sentence. Kaelan Aldrich, 21 years old, stood at the mirror across the room, admiring the way the morning light caught his wavy golden hair and warmed his amber eyes. His robe was the color of sunlight itself, gold thread woven into white silk, a robe that had taken 3 tailors 2 weeks to finish. He smiled at his reflection the way a performer smiles before stepping onto a stage, and when he finally turned to Rowan, his smile did not change, though something behind his eyes flickered, quick and sharp, dawned before anyone else could have noticed it. He told Rowan to wish him luck. Rowan did, softly, and meant it, because despite everything, despite years of being placed second, being placed last, being placed nowhere at all, Rowan had never once wished harm on his brother. He simply wished, quietly, that somewhere in all of this, there might be a small corner of the world meant for him too. The carriage ride to the selection hall was long and silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears. Rowan watched the fields pass by outside the window, gold and green blurring together, while his mother spoke only to Kaelan, reminding him how to bow, how to laugh at the right moments, how to let his voice dip low and warm when addressing someone of importance. Rowan listened without meaning to. He had heard these instructions so many times over the years that he could have repeated them in his sleep, though no one had ever bothered giving them to him. Finn was waiting near the servants' entrance when they arrived, his brown hair messy despite his best efforts, his freckled face breaking into a grin the moment he spotted Rowan stepping down from the carriage. Finn was 20 years old and had grown up alongside Rowan since they were children, back when Rowan was still allowed to run through the gardens instead of being tucked away behind closed doors. Finn was a beta, and though his place in the household was humble, he had always treated Rowan with a warmth that Rowan's own family rarely offered. He fell into step beside Rowan as they entered the grand hall, whispering that Rowan looked nice, that grey suited him, that he hoped today would be kind to him for once. The selection hall was vast, its ceilings high and carved with old patterns of vines and stars, its floor polished to a mirror shine that reflected the hundreds of candles lining the walls. Omega families from every corner of the region filled the rows of seats, whispering behind fans and sleeves, watching each other with careful, competitive eyes. Rowan was led to the very back corner, exactly where his mother had instructed, and he sat there quietly, folding his hands in his lap, while Kaelan was seated near the front with the other favored sons, his golden robe catching every eye that passed. When the great doors finally opened, a hush fell over the hall so complete that even the candles seemed to hold their breath. Alpha Draven Vosk entered, 24 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his short black hair neat above sharp dark blue eyes that swept the room with quiet authority. He wore formal were the color of deep navy trimmed in silver, and though he said nothing yet, the weight of his presence alone made every Omega in the hall sit a little straighter, hope a little harder. He moved down the center aisle slowly, pausing before each family, exchanging brief words, nodding politely, his expression giving away nothing. When he reached the front row, Kalen rose gracefully and bowed low, his voice honeyed and practiced as he introduced himself, speaking of his accomplishments, his family's honor, his hopes for the future. Draven listened, polite but unmoved, and Lady Miran watched from the side with a proud, tight smile, certain that her son had secured his place. But then Draven's gaze lifted, drifting past Kalen entirely, moving toward the back of the hall where shadows pooled thicker and the candlelight grew dim. His eyes found Rowan sitting quietly in the corner, hands folded, head slightly bowed, trying his best to disappear the way he had been taught to disappear his whole life. And instead of looking away, instead of continuing down the aisle as protocol demanded, Draven stopped walking entirely. He turned, and he walked straight toward the back of the hall, his footsteps echoing clean and deliberate against the polished floor. Whispers broke out across the room like a sudden wind through dry leaves. Kalen's smile faltered, then cracked, his amber eyes widening as he watched the alpha he had spent months preparing for walk directly past him without a second glance. Draven stopped before Rowan and asked, simply and clearly, what his name was. Rowan's breath caught in his throat. He had not been asked a direct question by anyone of importance in years. He managed to answer, his voice small but steady, and something shifted in Draven's expression when he heard it, something quiet and certain, like a man who had finally found the one thing he had been searching for without knowing its shape. The hall remained frozen in stunned silence. Lady Miran's proud smile had vanished completely, replaced by a look of horror she could not hide fast enough. Kalen sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white against his knees, his golden robe suddenly feeling like a costume from a performance that no one wanted to watch anymore. The rest of the selection blurred past in a haze of murmurs and stolen glances, other families presented, other names spoken, but the moment had already been decided in the minds of everyone present. Alpha Draven Vosk had looked past the golden-favored son and chosen instead to see the quiet one who had been told his whole life to stay unseen. That night, the Aldrich estate was quiet in a different way than usual, the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm breaks. Rowan was summoned to the garden by Kalen himself, and the moment he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he knew something in his brother had changed, or perhaps something that had always been there had simply stopped hiding. Kalen's voice trembled with fury as he accused Rowan of ruining everything, of stealing the one chance he had worked his whole life for. He said things Rowan had never heard him say aloud before, cruel words about how Rowan had always been a burden, how he had never deserved kindness, how their mother had only ever kept him hidden because he was something to be ashamed of. And then, in his anger, Kalen revealed the truth he had kept buried for years, that it was he who had whispered lies to their mother since they were children, telling her that Rowan was clumsy, sickly, unworthy of attention, weaving a story so convincing that Lady Miran had built Rowan's entire quiet, hidden life around it. Rowan stood frozen in the garden, the cool night air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. Every year of silence, every year of being told to sit quietly and let his brother shine, had never truly been his own choice at all. It had been built brick by brick from his own brother's jealousy and lies, and the weight of that realization settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Before he could even begin to process the betrayal, Lady Miran arrived in the garden, her face pale and set with grim determination. She announced, without warmth or apology, that the family records would be changed, that Kalen would be presented as the one Draven had truly met, that Rowan was to leave the estate quietly and never speak a word of what had happened at the selection. She did not ask if he understood. She simply expected it, the way she had always expected his silence. Rowan looked at his mother, then at his brother, searching for even a flicker of hesitation, some small sign that this was hard for them too. He found none. And so, with nothing left to hold him there, Rowan turned and walked away from the only home he had ever known, his heart heavy but his back straight, Finn appearing at his side without a single word needed between them, ready to walk into whatever uncertain road lay ahead. The road away from a place that never wanted you can feel longer than any map would suggest, and for Rowan Aldrich, the journey from his family's estate to the edge of the city felt like walking through a dream he could not wake from, one slow, uncertain step at a time. Finn walked beside him the entire way, carrying what little they had managed to bring, refusing to let Rowan carry anything heavier than his own grief. The two of them said little during the first day of travel, the shock of everything that had happened still settling over Rowan like a fog he could not quite see through. It was only when they stopped to rest beneath the shade of an old oak tree that Finn finally spoke, telling Rowan gently that whatever had happened back there, whatever lies had been told about him, none of it had ever been true, and none of it ever would be. Rowan did not answer right away. He simply stared out at the open fields ahead of them, his silver hair catching the afternoon light, his grey eyes distant with thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. It would take more than kind words to undo 19 years of being told he did not matter, but Finn's steady presence beside him was, for the first time in a long while, a comfort that asked for nothing in return. They reached the edge of the city 2 days later, a place far removed from the grand halls and polished floors of the estate, where narrow streets twisted between small shops and modest homes, and the air smelled of bread and flowers instead of perfume and old family pride. It was there that Rowan found work at a small flower shop tucked between a bakery and a tailor, run by an elderly woman named Sela who asked no questions about his past and simply handed him an apron and a pair of gardening shears. The work suited Rowan in ways he had not expected. There was something quiet and honest about tending to flowers, trimming stems, arranging petals into careful bouquets, watching things grow under patient care instead of neglect. Finn found work nearby as well, helping at the bakery, and the two of them settled into small rented rooms above the flower shop, a life far smaller than the one Rowan had been born into, but far gentler than anything he had known in years. Still, the nights were hard. Rowan would lie awake replaying his brother's cruel words in the garden, wondering how much of his childhood had been shaped by lies he never knew existed, wondering if there had ever been a version of himself his family could have loved without needing him to disappear first. Finn would often hear him stirring through the thin walls and would knock softly, sitting with him until the worst of the memories passed, never pushing him to speak before he was ready. Meanwhile, far from the quiet streets where Rowan now lived, Alpha Draven Vosk had not accepted the story he had been given. He was a man who trusted his instincts above all else, and every instinct in him rebelled against the idea that the golden, polished son presented to him after the selection was the same quiet, grey-eyed young man who had caught his attention from across a crowded hall. When Lady Miran attempted to formally present Kaelin as the chosen companion, Draven refused outright, stating plainly that he had asked for a name, and the name he had been given did not match the one now standing before him. His refusal caused a quiet scandal among the noble families, whispers spreading faster than anyone could contain them, but Draven paid little attention to the gossip. Instead, he began making careful inquiries of his own, speaking with household staff who had once served the Aldrich family, piecing together fragments of truth from servants who remembered a quiet second son who had once loved the gardens before he was slowly shut away from them. It took him nearly 3 weeks to find where Rowan had gone, following whispered rumors of a silver-haired young man working at a flower shop near the edge of the city. When Draven finally arrived outside the small shop, dressed plainly instead of in his formal navy and silver, he stood outside for a long moment before stepping in, unsure how he might be received after everything that had happened. Rowan was arranging white lilies into a vase when the bell above the door chimed, and when he looked up to see Draven standing there, his heart seemed to stop entirely. Shame flooded through him first, hot and sudden, the fear that Draven had come to see for himself the broken, unworthy person his family had always claimed him to be. He nearly turned away, but Draven spoke before he could, his voice calm and steady, asking only if he might have a moment of Rowan's time. They sat together in the small back room of the shop, surrounded by buckets of fresh-cut flowers, and for a long while neither of them spoke. It was Draven who broke the silence first, telling Rowan plainly that he had not come to demand anything, that he only wished to understand the truth, because the story he had been given after the selection had never sat right with him. Slowly, hesitantly, Rowan began to speak. He told Draven about the years of being kept hidden, about his mother's cold indifference, about the small lies that had shaped his entire childhood without his knowledge. He told him about the night in the garden, about Kaelin's confession, about the years of jealousy that had quietly poisoned every relationship in his family. Draven listened without interrupting, his sharp blue eyes steady and patient, and when Rowan finally fell silent, exhausted from carrying the weight of it all out loud for the first time, Draven simply said that none of what had been done to him was ever his fault. It was a small sentence, simple and plain, but it settled into Rowan's chest like sunlight breaking through clouds that had sat heavy for years. He had spent so long believing that his silence, his smallness, his years of being placed last, were things he deserved, things that made sense because something must have been wrong with him. Hearing someone say otherwise, someone who had no reason to lie, cracked something open in him that he did not know how to name yet. Over the following weeks, Draven returned often, never pushing, never demanding more than Rowan was ready to give. They took slow walks through the quieter streets of the city in the evenings, sharing simple meals at small tables outside modest cafes, talking about small things at first, favorite flowers, childhood memories that did not hurt too much to recall, the kind of easy conversation that Rowan had never truly experienced with anyone outside of Finn. Finn watched this unfolding friendship with quiet approval, often reminding Rowan of small, good memories from their shared childhood that Kaelin's lies had buried under years of doubt, moments when Rowan had laughed freely, had been clever and kind and full of light before he learned to shrink himself down. Piece by piece, those memories began to surface again, and piece by piece, Rowan began to remember who he had been before he was taught to disappear. There was an evening, weeks into this quiet unfolding friendship, when Rowan and Draven sat together on a low stone wall overlooking the city as the sun began to set, painting the rooftops in soft shades of orange and gold. Rowan admitted, quietly, that he was afraid to hope for anything good, afraid that happiness was something meant for other people, people who had not spent their whole lives being told they were less. Draven turned to him then, his expression serious and gentle all at once, and told him that he had walked past a hall full of people dressed in gold and silk without a second thought, because the moment he saw Rowan sitting quietly in the corner, he had known immediately that he was looking at someone real, someone whose worth had nothing to do with how loudly he was allowed to shine. Rowan felt something in his chest loosen at those words, a knot he had carried so long he had forgotten it was even there. For the first time since leaving the estate, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not involve hiding, a life where he was not an afterthought but someone chosen, someone seen. But even as healing slowly took root in Rowan's heart, trouble was already stirring far behind them. Word reached Draven through one of his trusted contacts within the noble circles that Lady Miran and Kaelin had not accepted their loss quietly. Whispers spoke of secret meetings, of plans being drawn in the shadows, of a scheme meant to discredit Rowan entirely and destroy whatever happiness he had begun to build in his new life. Draven said nothing of this to Rowan right away, not wanting to shatter the fragile peace that had only just begun to settle over him. Instead, he quietly began gathering what proof he could find, determined that if Lady Miran and Kaelin intended to bring their lies into the light once more, they would find the truth waiting for them this time, unshaken and unafraid. And so, as autumn winds began to sweep gently through the narrow streets of the city, carrying the scent of falling leaves and distant wood smoke, Rowan continued his quiet life at the flower shop, healing a little more each day, unaware that the storm his family had once used to bury him was gathering once more on the horizon, and that this time, he would not be facing it alone. Truth has a way of returning to a place long after it has been buried, and on the morning the Aldrich carriage rolled into the quiet edge of the city, Rowan Aldrich had no idea that the storm his family once used to silence him was about to break apart entirely, and this time it would break in his favor. Lady Miran had spent weeks convincing herself that her son's disgrace could still be undone, and Kaelin, still bitter from the humiliation of the selection, had agreed eagerly to whatever plan might restore his standing among the noble families. They arrived at the small square near the flower shop with a handful of hired witnesses, nobles who owed Lady Miran favors, and a carefully rehearsed story meant to paint Rowan as unstable, dishonest, and unworthy of any alpha's attention, let alone one as respected as Draven Vosk. Rowan was arranging fresh chrysanthemums near the front window of the shop when he heard the commotion outside, familiar voices raised just enough to draw a small crowd. His hand stilled over the flowers as he recognized his mother's cold, practiced tone, and beside it, his brother's voice, sharp and performative, already spinning a story loud enough for passers-by to hear. Sela, the shop owner, placed a steady hand on Rowan's shoulder, telling him quietly that he did not have to face this alone. Finn appeared at his side almost instantly, his freckled face set with fierce determination, and together the three of them stepped outside just as Lady Miran began her performance in earnest, gesturing toward Rowan with practiced sorrow, telling the gathering crowd that her poor, troubled son had fled home after a mental collapse, inventing wild stories that never happened, embarrassing the family who had only ever tried to protect him. It was, Rowan realized with a strange, distant clarity, the exact same tactic that had kept him quiet his whole life, only now performed loudly in public instead of whispered behind closed doors. He felt the old fear rise in his chest, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to disappear the way he always had. But before that fear could take hold completely, a familiar voice cut through the noise of the gathering crowd, calm, clear, and unshaken. Alpha Draven Vosk stepped forward from where he had been quietly observing near the edge of the square, his tall frame and sharp dark blue eyes commanding immediate attention even without raising his voice. He addressed Lady Miran directly, stating plainly that he had already heard every version of this story that the Aldrich family wished to tell, and that he had spent the past several weeks gathering the truth instead of relying on convenient rumors. He produced, calmly and without theatrics, a small bundle of letters, old correspondence between Kaelan and a household tutor from years past, letters in which Kaelan himself had written detailed instructions on what lies to tell Lady Miran about Rowan's supposed clumsiness and poor health. Beside the letters, Draven presented signed statements from former household staff, servants who had once cared for both brothers and had quietly watched Rowan slowly pushed out of his own family's affection through years of careful manipulation. The crowd that had gathered to witness Rowan's public humiliation instead fell into stunned murmurs as the truth was laid bare before them. Kaelan's carefully rehearsed composure cracked instantly, his amber eyes wide with panic as nobles who had once admired him began whispering among themselves, their expressions shifting from sympathy toward disgust. He attempted to argue, his voice rising in desperation, claiming the letters were forgeries, that the servants had been paid to lie, but his protests only sounded more hollow with every word, especially when one of the former household staff stepped forward herself, an older woman who had cared for Rowan as a small child, and confirmed everything Draven had presented was true. Lady Miran's proud composure finally shattered as well, her red gown suddenly looking less like a symbol of power and more like a costume for a role she could no longer play convincingly. She looked at Rowan, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across her face, not quite regret, but perhaps the beginning of understanding just how deeply her favoritism had wounded the son she had never truly looked at. Rowan did not shout. He did not demand an apology or revel cruelly in his brother's unraveling. Instead, he stepped forward quietly, his silver hair catching the midday light, and spoke in the same soft, steady voice he had always used, though now it carried a strength that had not been there before. He told the gathered crowd, calmly and without anger, that he had spent 19 years believing he was unworthy of love simply because his own family had convinced him it was true. He said he did not wish harm on his mother or his brother, only that he wished to finally live a life built on truth instead of silence. His words settled over the square more powerfully than any accusation could have, and the nobles who had come expecting a scandal instead witnessed something far rarer, a quiet dignity that no amount of gold thread or rehearsed charm could ever imitate. Kaelan, stripped of the illusion he had spent his whole life building, was left standing alone as the crowd's sympathy shifted entirely away from him, his reputation crumbling in real time before the very people he had once impressed so easily. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through the noble circles of what had truly happened at the selection and in the years leading up to it. Families who had once sought favor with the Aldrich household began quietly distancing themselves from Lady Miran and Kaelan, unwilling to associate with a family built on manipulation and cruelty. Kaelan, once so certain of his golden future, found every door that had once opened easily for him now closed, his charm no longer enough to hide the truth that had finally caught up to him. Lady Miran was left to face the consequences of her own choices as well, her standing among the noble families diminished, her household quieter than it had ever been, filled now with the silence she had once forced upon her own son. Rowan felt no joy in their downfall, only a quiet sense of release, as though a weight he had carried for 19 years had finally been set down for good. He did not need to see his mother and brother suffer to know that he had been right to walk away, right to believe, even in his darkest moments, that he deserved more than the small, silent life he had been given. That evening, as the last of the crowd dispersed and the square grew quiet once more, Draven found Rowan standing near the flower shop, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the rooftops. He stepped beside him, close but unhurried, and told him softly that he had never once regretted walking past his brother that day in the selection hall, that he had known instantly, without a single doubt, exactly who he had been looking for. Rowan turned to him, his grey eyes bright with something that had been missing from them for a very long time, hope, unguarded and real. Draven reached for his hand, holding it gently, and told him plainly, in front of Finn and Sela and the quiet, fading light of the city, that he wished for Rowan to stand beside him properly this time, not hidden in a corner, not told to stay silent, but seen fully, chosen completely, and loved without condition. Finn cheered from where he stood nearby, unable to contain his happiness for his oldest friend, and Sela smiled warmly from the shop doorway, watching the quiet, kind boy she had taken in finally step into a life that matched the light she had always seen in him. Rowan laughed, soft and genuine, a sound that had been buried under years of forced silence, finally free to exist without fear. As the days turned into weeks, Rowan began a new chapter of his life, one built not on the lies of his family or the shadows he had once been forced to hide within, but on truth, patience, and a love that had never once looked away, not from the very first moment, not through every trial that followed, and not now, as he finally stepped fully into the light he had always deserved. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next beautiful story of love, healing, and second chances.